I'd like to ask the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture on what basis he granted interested person status in the planning system to Manx National Heritage for registered buildings considerations, and what plans he has to extend the status to Manx Wildlife Trust for nature conservation and environmental considerations.
On the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Manx National Heritage have been expressly awarded interested person status in respect of applications relating only to registered building consent and the deregistration of buildings as part of the Town and Country Planning Registered Buildings Act Regulations 2013. MNH is a designated body of the Isle of Man Government that is partially supported by the Government for its core heritage activities and partly by charitable donations. Its remit is, amongst other things, to advise on development and changes in the island's historic environment and natural landscape. There is a clear argument that they are government's heritage specialists. There are also many heritage charities on the island, and whilst they do not have this automatic status, they are of course able to contribute to the public consultations regarding building registration. Turning now specifically to the Manx Wildlife Trust, who are a well-respected charity that provide, amongst other things, conservation advice and an education. There are a significant number of not dissimilar organisations on the island. They are all welcome to submit comments regarding applications. However, no organisation is identified as a statutory consultation in the town and country planning legislation. For example, we resource and chair and provide a secretariat for the Conservation Forum, which comprises 18 members, all with similar interests. Acknowledging the earlier question, which highlighted the level of recent consultation already undertaken on this matter, there are no plans at this time to extend automatic interested party status to the Manx Wildlife Trust.
On to question, Mr Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Is the Minister aware that Section 40 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1999 requires the Council of Ministers to establish a body for the purpose of obtaining views of organisations in the island appearing to the Council of Ministers to be concerned with any of the following matters? A. The environment. It goes on to say that a development order or regulations under this Act A. Provide for the designation by the Department of voluntary organisations in the island appearing to the Department to be concerned with the environment. These new procedures, agreed by the Minister for Environment without Tynwald agreement, fly in the face of this legislation and our biosphere status. Will the Minister undertake to urgently review this action and come back to this honourable court with procedures which are compliant with this legislation? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. As I said earlier, part of the programme for government was a commitment to review the planning process, and this has taken place. There's been extensive public consultation. This was not a matter that was raised. There is a bill coming before this honourable in another place shortly, which will amend the Planning Acts, and I am inclined to go with the consultation and the current situation rather than Section 40. I think you said the 1990 Act.
1999.
1998. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Mr Henderson.
Good morning, Secretary. I'm just curious with the Shafeshok's answers there. Does he not feel that nature conservation, biodiversity, should not be given the same status as registered buildings, given we have a biosphere status recognition currently, and that would he not think it would be a fair idea to have the Manx Wildlife Trust as the lead conservation organisation, given their considerable scientific expertise and standing within the conservation movement within the Isle of Man, as the lead organisation and representative of the smaller organisations he just mentioned, and that indeed our biodiversity should be given the recognition it deserves?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Certainly biodiversity is a key issue at the moment, and I can advise that we are looking at operational policy in terms of how we address the issues. But I would say that under the normal planning process, all of the organisations that are mentioned here, including the Wildlife Trust, have rights to make representations, and we take their advice very seriously prior to an application going before committee. So that there is already a process, and certainly when it comes to environmental issues, these are considered very carefully by officers, and we have various policies within the Planning Act that relate to looking at environmental issues.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Masker.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I wonder if the Minister could tell me, did his department consult with Manx National Heritage when they clarified the responsibilities of that body with regard to protecting and safeguarding registered buildings and conservation areas? And is the Minister aware that, by their own admission, Manx National Heritage have a limited amount of resources which would enable them to respond meaningfully with regard to this element of our built heritage? They were only able to submit on 3 completed applications last year, that's 2018, and there are ongoing matters under consideration now. But because of their lack of resources, i.e. staffing and other matters, they have intimated to me that they do lack resources to undertake this role in a meaningful way, and so represent the important views with regard to this important sector of our environment.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. As I indicated earlier, there are other organisations in that sector that are also consulted. But recently we have employed a full-time registration officer with expertise in this field. So we do have in-house resource now, which we are using to good effect, and moving on the registration process of a number of buildings that have stalled for some time, and certainly addressing issues when buildings at risk come up. And this is something that's not really happened credibly for some time. With regard to Manx National Heritage, their interested party or person status in terms of the Town and Country Planning Act predates my involvement, as that was in 2013, so I'm not sure what process took place at that particular juncture.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. In his previous answer to the Honourable Member for Middle, Mr. Shimmins' question, I think the Minister said that this issue of specialist input was not raised in response to the public consultation. Does the Minister acknowledge actually that in the public consultation response, over 65% of respondents wanted to retain third-party appeal rights, and comment was made that these appeal rights allow those with specialist knowledge the ability to express their views, that developments may have wider island or community interests, development does not just affect those living adjacent, and interest groups with specialist knowledge should be listened to?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. We're straying off the subject matter with regard to Manx Wildlife Trust specifically. However, we have not removed interested party status from anyone, and I keep stressing that. Certainly when it comes to applications that require environmental impact assessments, or applications that affect land that is owned or managed by Manx Wildlife Trust, they would get almost automatically interested party status. We should also not forget that the planning process isn't just about appeals. The planning process is about considering applications and the officers reporting to the planning committee, and those reports resulting in a decision-making process by the committee. So at the beginning of the process and during most of the process, anyone is allowed to make representations that are considered by officers or the committee at the relevant time. It is only after a decision is made that the interested party status kicks in, or doesn't, as the case may be, if there is sufficient reason that it should. So people should not be discouraged from making representations early. We are one of the few jurisdictions that I know of, and certainly the UK generally doesn't have interested party status after an application is determined. So we should value that and use it properly, not use it as a tool, as has been used, not all the time, but has been used in the past, and this has been identified to stop or delay developments, not just for developers but also private individuals. It's a system that should be used correctly, but people should make proper representations prior to determination of application.
Supplementary question, Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. The Minister for Environment might want to read the actual responses to the consultation again, because his interpretation feels quite different from what is actually written down in print. It is disappointing that the Minister is refusing to grant Manx Wildlife Trust, the preeminent environmental and wildlife organisation on this island, which has been in place for 45 years, similar status than he is willing to grant to Manx National Heritage for registered buildings. Does he feel that in this respect he is complying with the Town and Country Act, Section 40, 1999?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I will take advice on that.
Supplementary question, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. Would the Minister agree with me that it is a problem to decide which wildlife society we should engage with? We are constantly engaging as a department with the Manx Nature Conservation Forum, which we actually provide services for people to come along and express their views. I can just give you a few of the members that regularly attend. Manx Wildlife Trust, Isle of Man Mammal Society, Manx Bat Group, Manx Butterfly Conservation, Manx BirdLife, Isle of Man Beekeepers, Isle of Man Friends of the Earth, Isle of Man Woodland Trust, the Manx National Farmers Union, Manx Ornithological Society, Manx Biological Recording Partnership Group, Isle of Man Friends of the Earth, UNESCO Biosphere Office, the Director of Energy Policy comes along as well, Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, Manx Wildlife Trust, and Manx National Heritage. Now, who would you give preference to, Minister, if any of those wanted to have a voice?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. As I alluded to initially, there are 18 plus groups represented in the Manx Nature Conservation Forum. These include organisations that are also nationally recognised, like National Farmers Union, and it is difficult, and that's where we have to draw the line somewhere. And as I keep stating, all interested parties can make representations on an application prior to its consideration, and I would encourage them to do so, rather than going through a list of picking people out or organisations out and making them automatically interested parties. It should be justified, and there's a rationale behind the system and the way we work, and we have consulted on the way that we are working at the moment.
Supplementary question, Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy President. Would the Minister agree with me that environmental considerations run throughout the whole of the strategic plan which underpins planning policy, that any party or group can submit comments to a planning application and it will be considered, that all interested person status does is give the right to a party to initiate an appeal, and that in every case the local authority always has interested person status?
Yeah.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I thank the Chairman of the Planning Committee for clarifying the situation. That is indeed the situation, and as I have said in other forum, he's correct. Local authorities all retain the automatic right for interested party status, and other parties can lobby local authorities if they feel that they have been disadvantaged, and they can enter an appeal if necessary.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Masker.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. Would the Minister agree with me that the in-house expertise that you have is in the form of a registered buildings officer? It's not a conservation officer who would advise across the piece on conservation. It's merely limited to registered buildings. And would the Minister undertake to look into the provisions of the Town and Country Planning Act 1999, whereby the Department did undertake to appoint a body with special interest and able to advise the Planning Department or the Planning Committee on these very specialist matters? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I think I've already undertaken to take advice on the 1999 Section 40 Act, and I am not sure of the qualification of the registered building individual, but I'm very happy to report back to the member and inform on that.
Supplementary question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy President. Just a little concerned about the wide list of organisations that Mr. Perkins, the Honourable Member for Garth, laid out. My understanding of the interested person policy that's been approved means that one of those organisations, in order to qualify under this policy, would have to actually own or occupy a piece of land within 20 metres of the proposed development, which means when it comes to starting an appeal process in respect of a registered building, Manx National Heritage could stand up and start that appeal process themselves. My question to the Minister is there any way, in respect of conservation, that any of these conservation bodies that have been so helpfully listed for us today could become an interested party and could start an appeal process without having to physically own a plot of land adjacent to the development itself?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. The only situation that would allow organisations like the Manx Wildlife Trust to start initiate interested party status would be if it was a larger scale scheme and there was an environmental impact assessment. Apart from that, unless you're a local authority or Manx National Heritage, you will need to have a material interest in what happens on that site and be close in proximity to it.
Final supplementary on this goes to the original question of Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy President. I'd like to ask the Minister, after his colleague from Department of Environment listed 18 environmental groups, why none of these groups has been listed in Section 40 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1999, which does require the designation by the Department of voluntary organisations in the island appearing to be concerned with the environment. So we've got 18. Is it just too complicated? He can't pick one? Is that where this feeling lies? Or is this a more fundamental feeling that he is less concerned about protection for the Manx countryside? And does the Minister for the Environment feel that his recent actions demonstrate a responsible approach to safeguarding our natural environment?
Minister to reply.
Mr. Deputy President, I show no disregard for the environment. In fact, my department is coming forward with much environmental protection legislation and strategy. With regard to 18 environmental groups, there is some rationale in not selecting one, because if you select one, they will all want it. And as I said earlier, and I keep repeating this, there is no restriction on people, organisations, making proper representations to an application prior to its determination. As the Chairman of the Planning Committee reiterated, they are all taken into serious consideration.